And we are going to be recording this session for anybody who was not able to be here. All of our sessions will be recorded. We hope that you can attend them all, but we know that life happens, and if there's a time when you can't make a session, it is probably a good idea to try to catch up with the recording so that you can hear what some of the discussion was and keep up. All of the materials relative to this class, the reflections that you post on the forum and the videos of the class is all part of a closed group. So nobody else will be able to access this material other than people in the class, Jermaine, myself, and Pat Kahn at the Faith Development Office at the UU. There's Iris. Yay, Iris. So with that, I say welcome, folks. We are going to begin with a reading. Jermaine, am I leading that or are you leading that?
I thought we were going to alternate.
We are going to alternate, but somebody has to tell people what we're doing. So I'll do that. This is the fun of being in an online class. But coincidentally, Jermaine and I are both in the same state, which doesn't usually happen with webinar leaders. Usually we're on opposite sides of the country. So we are going to begin with a reading, and later on, we would like everybody in the class to have an opportunity to participate in an opening or a closing. And we have a Google folder, which you will be able to access through the class page. I'm not sure if the link is up there yet, but we have created a little sign-up sheet. So folks who wish to, and there's not quite enough openings and closings for everybody. So if you're on the shyer side, you may not have to fill a spot. So, but today Jermaine and I are going to take turns reading, and we'd like to invite you to read along with us. We'll read the standard type and invite you to read the italicized statements. And if you want to, open up your mic so that we can hear the chorus of voices, it would be lovely. Again, if you prefer to stay quiet, that's okay. So, Jermaine, would you like to start us?
Sure. In this world, there have always been many opinions about faith and salvation.
You need not think alike to love alike.
There must be knowledge in faith also.
Sanctified reason is the lantern of faith.
Religious reform can never be all at once, but gradually, step by step.
If they offer something better, I will gladly learn.
The most important spiritual function is conscience, the source of all spiritual joy and happiness.
Conscience will not be quieted by anything less than truth and justice.
We must accept God's truth in this lifetime. Salvation must be accomplished here on earth.
God is indivisible.
Egi az isten.
God is one. And so for these sessions, every time we meet, we'll have a breakdown like this. You'll have an idea of what the timeline's going to be. So we started off with our chalice reading, and now we're going to introduce ourselves to each other and eventually develop a covenant. So I like popcorn style. I don't like to dictate who gets to go when. So as you feel moved, unmute your microphones and introduce yourself to us by sharing your name, your preferred pronouns, and what location you're in, what congregation you serve, and what the size of your program is, small, medium, or large. Or if you work at a fellowship or offline someplace as a affiliate congregation. So who would you like to start?
Here's Megan. Welcome, Megan. I'll start. I'm Pat, also known as Patricia. I answer to either. I am she, her, hers, my preferred pronoun. I work for the Central East Region staff, which is part of the UUA's congregational life staff. So I work directly with congregations in the field. So I'm not working, I'm working with a constituency of 200 congregations, and I'm more closely connected with about 30 congregations. Who's next?
I can go next.
Great.
My name is Jaquise Robertson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the DRE for the Unitarian Universalist Community Church of Southwest Michigan in Portage, Michigan. So I'm part of the Mid-America region. And we have a small RE program.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm going to jump in. My name is Jermaine Kripe, she, her, hers. My congregation is Beacon Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Summit, New Jersey, which is about 30 minutes outside of New York City. And the size of our program is actually large. We have 135 kids registered. I want to say it's 140 something, but I think that's different because some of the kids have moved up. And our youth program is 120 registered between 6th grade and 12th grade, and an active participation of about 70 of those kids each week. I'm the youth director at the congregation, so my domain is middle school and high school.
I can go next. My name is Heather. Pronouns she, her, hers. I am the DRE at Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Gainesville in Gainesville, Florida. And we have a small program. My big weekends are 25 kids. But we have about 200 members in our congregation and anywhere from 25 to 30 kids active at this point. So.
Cool. Welcome.
I can go. My name is Jess Bors. Can you hear me okay?
We can, Jess.
Okay, great, because I have a new microphone and I can't hear myself.
Ah.
My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the acting DRE part-time at Bucksmont UU Fellowship in Warrenton, Pennsylvania, which is just north of Philadelphia. But I live in Easton, Pennsylvania, just 8 miles from New Jersey. The congregation thinks they're bigger than they really are. We have 50 registered young people, and we have about 25 weekly as our average attendance.
And I am Laurel Whitehouse. I am, I prefer she, her, hers. I work for the congregation in Milton, Massachusetts, which I think of as medium, and I'm I oversee nursery through high school.
Hey everybody, I'm Carolyn. I am the Director of Religious Education at Allen Avenue Church in Portland, Maine. And I've been on the job for 2 years, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. The relative size of my program is we have 62 regularly enrolled and about 30 to 40 attending Sunday, including visitors. We have about 250 members in the congregation.
Hi there, my name is Beth Moss. I am the Director of Religious Education at First Unitarian Church in Chicago, Illinois. I prefer he, she, her, hers for my pronouns. I've been the DRE here only for a couple of months, but I previously served as the DRE in Cedar Rapids, Iowa a couple years ago. Our program here is on the medium size of small. On an average Sunday, we have, I'd say, about 25 students in attendance, depending on whether we're counting owl or not. So that's it.
Thank you. So a few more of you guys left, so jump on in. Don't be shy.
Okay, so I'm Iris. I use she, her, hers, and the relative size of my congregation is like, we have like 300 members. And I'm having a lot of audio trouble, so hopefully you can all hear me.
We can. And where are you located at?
I'm in Montclair, in New Jersey.
Thank you.
So Jenny's having some mic trouble. So Jenny, just go ahead and just check in on the chat, and we'll read it for you. And Amy has joined us, and I think Megan has not checked in. Where's Megan?
Hi, sorry. My name is Megan Ross. I am a member at West Shore Unitarian Universalist Church. We're a large congregation. I'm not sure how many youth are in our program. I'm a member of the board, and I've been teaching Sunday school there for over 20 years. I am a trained facilitator for Our Whole Lives and for Spirit Play, and I'm also doing a trip to our partner church in Romania this summer, so that's one of the reasons I'm taking this class.
That's great.
Yeah. Enjoy the trip. My congregation alternates every year, and I'm going to be going not this summer but next summer, so I'm excited to hear more about what your trip entailed, if you have an opportunity to share when you get back.
I'd be happy to.
So I'm going to pop in on Jenny's behalf and just say her pronouns are she, her, hers, and she is at Southwest UU in the Cleveland area. It's a small church with about 90 members and 35 registered children and youth. So welcome, Jenny.
Welcome.
And Sarah and Amy.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes, Amy.
I had some mic trouble this morning too. So I'm Amy Brock. My preferred pronouns are she, her pronouns. My congregation is the UU Church in Vancouver, Washington. We have about 250 members and 70 registered children at this moment.
Super.
Cool. And I guess Sarah's last.
Yep. Audio problems. I am an interim at the Unitarian Society of Santa Barbara. Oh my goodness. 500 members, 40 kiddos. I hope that you are safe with all of the weather and climate concerns that have been happening in your area. And I have California family, so we've been following it very closely.
Yeah, you guys be safe out there. It's nuts. All right. Well, thank you. Every time you meet as a class, usually even in your own congregation, you guys are pretty familiar with the idea of the covenant. And so we are going to try to put a covenant together. And we can adjust it as it's going, because obviously covenants are a living document. So there are a few general things that we had put on the list here that we can totally add to if you feel so moved. But they're pretty self-explanatory. And Pat, I don't know if you want to walk them through it or.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. And I appreciate that folks have done, most of you have already been able to do this, which is to arrive on time and to test your tech, as you can. We are, hopeful that you will be able to attend every session. But as I said to somebody, we're not without compassion. We know that things happen. So arriving on time is helpful. Whoops.
Sorry.
That's all
Went
right.
too far.
It will come back. It will come back. Reading the materials in advance, there is, for this particular class, there is a breadth and depth of materials that is probably a little, if you've taken other Renaissance modules, it may be a little bit more than you're used to. And I can also say that there is a great deal more that you can read if you are a lover of history, or if there's a particular piece that you're passionate about. But we want people to be able to participate in the discussion. And some of the questions, you know, if you've skimmed the material, you'll be able to feel like you can participate fully. But some of them, you know, you'll really want to dig in and read up as much as possible. There is a requirement for this class to do a written reflection every week. It's a 250-word reflection. Basically, what we're asking you to do is to think about the reading, to think about the discussion that we've had in class, to consider ways that either you've been moved, excited, enthused, and how you might use that in your work. How might that enthusiasm translate into something, a way that you can, a story that you can tell, a curriculum you might want to look into? How are you going to use it? So we would like you to be able to complete those reflections by Monday at noon. So we're meeting Thursday. So that's giving you Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and into Monday. And we know that many of you, obviously, you're working on Sunday, and some of you have Monday off. But if you can make that happen, that gives other folks, an opportunity to read the reflection that you've written and, you know, be further inspired by what you have, by what you've shared. And if you want to, you know, respond as time allows to other folks' postings, that is great. Jermaine and I will be reading everything. Pat Kahn also pops in and reads most of the writing. So it's not just going into an abyss. There will be people who will be appreciating your work. And then just being aware of the space you're taking up. We have limited time here, and we have, you know, this is a full class. We were actually a little oversubscribed, but we're good numbers wise. So when we have, you know, 15 or 20 minutes to take care of, to work together, work through a discussion question, everybody may not be able to contribute. Everybody may not have the same amount of time. So just if we would be, use as much brevity as you can, and also just, Jermaine and I are responsible for making sure that we hear from everybody during the course of 2 hours. But if you notice that you're taking up a little bit more space than feels comfortable, step back.
Yep. That's the youth phrase, step forward, step back. I wanted to clarify a little bit of advice as someone who not only took this class online, but has taught it for a while. In the reflections, it may seem that 250 words seems like a large amount. It's not really. And if you actually use that time for Monday, for example, that could be something that could be written in 30 minutes. As far as responding to other people's reflections, you are not required to respond to every single one. I just wanted to clarify that because that would make it seem ridiculous, the amount of work. If there's one or two in each session that inspire you, or you want to counterpoint an argument or add something to it, please feel free to do so. But it's more of a idea of that you're listening and reading each other's work and possibly pulling insights from each other. So you're not required to reply to all of them, but for at least a couple each session. And there's no 250-word requirement to the response. Okay?
Yeah, 250 words is it's basically a long paragraph. So,
yeah.
And, you know, we're not counting.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? Is there anything else that folks feel would be useful to add to this in this moment? All right.
All right.
Hearing none. We're gonna.
All right.
We are right on time.
Yes, we are. Closing that one. So session 1, heresy. By definition, heresy is something that is against or angers folks in leadership of the church. And you know that we are those people. I mean, one of my favorite songs within the congregation is wanderer worshipers, lovers of leaving. If we have a problem with something, we have no problem sharing our piece and leaving if so moved. So we're hoping that you don't find the movement of leaving the thing you take from this, but that you look and examine and really reflect on the various pieces that we've taken from many faith traditions. And the first one that we're going to focus on is the foundation, our first, our origins, going all the way back to Jesus, as since both the Unitarian and the Universalist denominations are Christian based. They have obviously evolved over the years, but that is where they came from. So Jesus is a cornerstone of both of those faiths. And if you, I'm pretty sure Jesus has been fairly studied as religious educators for you guys, but it began really with his death and the idea that your faith is can be utilized as a physical or a active participation. He was definitely one of the first social justice warriors we ever had, and he put himself out there, and it didn't end well. So he was crucified by the Romans for basically undermining the state. But you all know the story was told by the leaders of the church that were threatened by his idea that all people should be treated fairly. There is no real leadership except for God, and that people should live lives of helping and treating each other kindly and equitably. And that was just no way. Jewish leaders like their hierarchy, and so do many other people. So Jesus was the crux of it. Fast forward about 40 years, Jerusalem is still under the Roman rule, and the temple is destroyed as a kind of a blow to the culture as well as the consciences of the Jewish people, trying to break their hearts and hurt them. In the end, it actually didn't end up working in their favor. Jews thought of new ways of being faithful and figured out ways of practicing their faith, sometimes in secret, and they still continued their lives. But the figure of Jesus actually also ended up being a little bit alternate in there. There's a great book that I read, has something to do with Francis David and Michael Servetus, called Out of the Flames. And one of the things it talks about is the idea that divinity of Jesus was not really brought into play until this period, around 70, and further on when the temple of the Council of Nicaea, which gets organized.
Jermaine,
yeah?
Should we be seeing the timeline?
Are you seeing it?
No, I'm not.
Oh.
Are others seeing the timeline? No.
Oh, wait, I have the share on there. Let me pause and resume it. Okay. Resume the share. I'm going to end the slideshow for a second and just go right to, since we're sharing the screen. Can you see it now?
Give it a minute. I'm still seeing slides.
Technical difficulties, folks. I'm going to stop the share for a second and see if I can figure out what's going on, because that makes no sense. I just had it open.
Did folks have a chance to look at the interactive timeline around while you were doing your reading? Yeah, that was created by two previous participants as their final project. They were part of the pilot group, and it has been honed over a number of years. So nobody should feel intimidated by the fact that that was somebody's final project.
Okay.
All right, we're going to give it another go.
All right, let's see.
Do you want me to try to bring it up?
Nope, I'm going to the desktop. I'm just going to pull it straight from there, because technically the video is supposed to just pull up, and it didn't.
There it goes. So, there you go.
All right, death of Jesus. The temple, and now to Origen of Alexandria. He was a writer, a theologian, who talked about universal salvation and the idea that God doesn't condemn anybody to death. And for that idea of hell and not just basically disappearing, but being born over and over again, kind of has a bit of the Hindu ideas, on the ideas of the Hindu faith, about basically being reborn over and over again, so that you would actually learn to be more like God, or learn about being a better person, and eventually achieving that ultimate salvation. He did not believe in one and done, and that was a controversial way of thinking. Arius of Alexandria was a priest, actually, in the Middle East, who believed that Jesus was a great teacher and a perfect example, or a really good example of how to be, but he did not buy into the idea of him being God's son and being divine. He thought that many teachings of Jesus's were useful in helping people become closer to God, but he did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Then the Council of Nicaea happened in 325, and Constantine, the emperor at the time, as a way of stopping all the fighting, because since Jesus' death up until now, the idea of who is responsible, who are the teachers, who are the leaders, who is ultimately in charge, and what should people believe, was battled constantly. And Constantine, as a way of trying to just settle the argument once and done for all, decided to convene this council, who made the decision that the role of the church was going to be mandated by the leadership appointed by the emperor and his leadership. And so that is where a lot of the main dogma that falls under general Christianity falls in today, which is the Trinity, God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that the Bible is the absolute infallible truth, and that salvation, universal salvation, can be attained by living a life according to the practices and teachings in the Bible. But ultimately, during this time period, there were a lot of people who didn't read, and so they were dependent upon the religious scholars of the time to lead them correctly and advise them properly. And there were good ones and bad ones, as there always are. So the fights did not ultimately end. Origen of Alexandria comes back into play, and he actually lays out 4 terms that he believes are obviously not in the Bible. And as a scholar, he researched it and backed it up with scholarly teachings. But because of the council in Nicaea, it was considered heresy. In particular, that that we exist in a previous state versus being brand new creations by God, and that our bodies are transformed into something ethereal at our death and at the resurrections, that even all bad people, when Jesus comes back, even if they don't follow the teachings and live a good life, they are going to be saved. They'll receive salvation because of Christ's death. And that really angered a lot of people. And so he was declared a heretic. Generally, that was the practice of people who questioned the leadership in the Christian church up until 1400s, when Gutenberg's Bible was finally published. Owning a book was a precious item. Nobody who was a farmer or a shopkeeper or someone who had very little income really could afford books, because they were written by hand. And obviously the labor that went into it made it where if you actually owned books in your house, it was a sign of wealth. And many people didn't have books, so many people didn't know how to read until Gutenberg got the publishing press together, put the printing press together, and started the first bit of mass production, and was able to print this Bible and many other books in languages for everyone who was willing to read or learn how to read to publish. And that's when people also started to question a little bit more, or be able to get answers for themselves and not depend so heavily upon the church leadership for guidance. You've all probably, as you use, heard the story of Francis David. He was the advisor and a mentor to King John Sigismund of now what is Transylvania, of that portion of Hungary. And he represented the Unitarian position in a 10-day debate that was led in front of King John Sigismund. And at the end of the debate, his arguments were so strong that not only did King John approve the idea that you don't have to be a believer in God, the Trinity, or whatever, you can believe what you want so long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. And he then converted to Unitarianism. So he is known, King John, as our first Unitarian and only Unitarian king. And Francis David was directly responsible for that. Michael Servetus was another strong leader within the movement. Michael had the political juice. His family was wealthy. He was a practiced doctor and physician, and he was at one time very tight with John Calvin. And ultimately, it was John Calvin who ultimately led to his death, burning at the stake, by getting in a large theological debate that Michael Servetus actually won hands down. The book I referenced earlier, called Out of the Flames, and I'll put the title in the Arthur later on in the chat box, goes into great detail about the very polite but very vicious writing arguments that John Calvin and Servetus engaged in that ultimately led to his death. Because Calvin actually had followers and people in power who believed in him and the Trinity, and Servetus did not. So he was burned at the stake after being imprisoned, and it ultimately ended up in him being the better man, because in Switzerland, where John Calvin actually established the Calvinist church, there's a statue in town of Michael Servetus. So ultimately, Servetus is being held, at least within the Switzerland community and their history, as the guy who won the battle and was improperly imprisoned, as well as murdered, basically, because John Calvin was a bit of a bully and ultimately didn't like being told that he was wrong. Martin Luther in Germany published his 95 Theses and hung them on the church door, basically complaining about the idea that wealthy people are able to buy themselves salvation, basically allowing that heaven would be the place of the wealthy and that poor people were not going to be able to pay their way out of the sins that they committed. And that was absolutely anti-beliefs of Martin Luther, and he published his Theses in 1517, and it sparked a lot of people to leave the Catholic Church at the time and form other sects, and one of them being Lutheranism. Michael Servetus published his book, Errors of Divinity, Errors of the Trinity, and actually shows that the Trinity is not from the Bible, that it was a man-made contrivance. And he angered a lot of people in power, because the Trinity and the idea that you had to pray for salvation and become this follower believer of only what the leaders in the congregations or the councils believed you should follow. It didn't allow the freedom of questioning God. And as a believer and as a Trinitarian, as a scholar of the Word, he believed that that was actually one of the things that God gave us, the ability to reason and logic and think, and that we should be able to challenge the leadership and say, no, I don't buy this. And that's what his books did. And it ultimately was used as evidence to convict him and later burn him at the stake. Martin Luther's church is established in 1531 as one of the first breakoffs from the Catholic Church. John Calvin ultimately wrote a theology, a way of being, which was very detailed in how to worship and organize a church and how to behave. Very strict, no room for questioning, and it was scooped up and used quite heavily. Socinus wrote that Jesus was a savior, not because he was the Son of God, but because of the way he lived and not how he died. The words he used to take on the church and leadership, the way he helped the poor and fed the hungry and talked to anybody and never held anyone in higher esteem or lower esteem because of the job they had or the family he came from. He also did not believe in baptism. He didn't believe that there was a justification for it. If you just lived a good life, you were following Jesus, and that was considered heresy because that obviously took the power of doing good out of the hands of the church. Michael Servetus was burned at the stake for his beliefs and denying the Trinity, and also infant baptism. John Sigismund in 1568 put together the Edict of Torda and declared freedom of conscience and allowing people to openly study their own faith and their own beliefs, and that no one would be punished or mistreated because they did not believe what the majority believed. And that was a freeing thought for many people who questioned the church. In Poland, the idea of anti-Trinitarianism in Christianity actually took off very well. And it actually was the primary faith tradition in many of the leaders. It's one of the few places in the world that still have Unitarian exclusively churches that do have a lot of the trappings and rituals of a Christian congregation, but the one bit that is not held in high esteem is the idea of the Trinity. And their ideas are very, very similar to what we as Unitarians today follow. This is probably one of the first catechisms, a booklet that had a uniform group of prayers and sacraments and how to manage a congregation, other than the John Calvin ones. This is the Acts of Uniformity, and this was written for the Church of England, another sect that broke off during the Protestant Reformation. Joseph Priestley was one of our American Unitarian forebears, and he was a scientist again. We have a lot of thinkers in our backstories who believed that there were the scientific method. He believed in Jesus being a man, a great thinker, but a man. And that caused him to not only lose his home and his lab in England, but it forced him to have to flee to the United States and in fear of his life. And he was one of the people who helped establish one of the first Unitarian congregations in the country, the church in Philadelphia. This is a replica of the lab that was burned. Essex Street Chapel, which is still being used today in England, is considered the birthplace of European Universalism. And the churches are still in existence, and that building that you see right there in black and white is still being utilized as that. So Joseph Priestley moves to the United States and lives in Pennsylvania, and he continues his work as a leader and a scholar in the Unitarian Church. And that was the timeline. So the question to be asked of you guys is, what did you learn about Unitarian and Universalism from your readings in this session, and what most intrigued you? And because this class is so big, we are going to break you guys into what's called breakout rooms and assign you all pieces of the of this conversation to discuss in a smaller setting. So I don't know if Pat has done it. Pat, have you already set the breakouts, or would you like me to do that?
Pat is on mute. Pat, you're on mute.
Pat, you're still muted.
Yeah, I did not yet do the breakout rooms. I thought we were going to do the opening discussion with the whole group, and then when we got to going deeper, we were going to.
Okay.
Is that? We can do the going deeper right now.
Okay, I thought we were going to do it out loud. So yeah, we can actually do since we're all in the same room, we can just hop in. Was there something in the reading or stories that really stood out for you, or was there something in it that you did not know before that you know now?
As a relatively new UU, I was very pleased to realize how many heretics were our founding members. That made me very happy. Kind of that going against the grain and making people think from the get-go really spoke to me, I guess. I liked it a lot. So.
Right. Oh, the flames. Jenny, you're muted. It looked like you were. Oh, Carolyn, you want to go? Okay.
Hey, yeah, to me, like, this is the parts and pieces where, because I became a UU in 2006, and most of my church education was as an adult. So I've had it in bits and pieces, in like sermon and reading. I've never taken a history class before. so to me, like the timeline is really helpful because it's like when you take the subway and you only get off at one stop and you're like, okay, I don't know how this stop fits in with all the other stops in the system. It's like seeing that big subway map. So that's been really helpful. And I didn't initially realize how connected to like the roots of Judaism and Christianity the story of the heretics was. So that's been great.
Cool. Thank you, Carolyn. Jenny, I think you were kind of waving your hand like you were going to jump in. Let me unmute you. There you go. Try it now. No, we still can't hear you. Oh, you put your hand down. I think I just heard you.
Can you hear me through my phone?
Yes.
That's me the 330-212-9573. Okay. Sorry. I guess a couple things that really struck me was the idea, how far back the idea that Jesus was a human and teachings were important to be followed, and that he was a fine example, but a human still. And what was it in Alexandria? I forget the name.
There was Origen and Arius.
Origen and Arius. Those ideas and the four premises that went that far back in time was just very interesting to me.
Sarah pointed out, I did not realize how many of our early leaders did not buy into the divine Jesus, seeing him as a leader, not a deity.
Mm-hmm. That's always fascinated me, that really the theology of the Trinity was really a political choice, a political decision, as much as it was a theological decision. Anybody else have any?
I think for myself, so I studied religion in college, and so it was very interesting because like I knew all the history, but it like very nicely like sidestepped Unitarianism, Universalism. So as a relatively new UU myself, it was nice to see where it fit in. I was just like, oh, this is where this pops up and all of that. So that was the most interesting thing for myself and very fascinating. And I'm going to read a little bit more about that. I'm really interested to read that book that you suggested.
For me, as a child growing up, I was Unitarian. I was not Unitarian Universalist. I was UCC. And we always read the Nicene Creed, and I never really kind of knew where that came from. Mm-hmm. So it was nice to have the reference for that, and why I, to this day, don't read it when I go to visit, a church that tends to read it. Last year at Christmas, I took my daughter to a UCC congregation, and she was like, the story was great. I got all the backstory of the birth of Jesus, but she's like, what was with that reading? I didn't get that. So it was fun to have that reference.
That said, I thought it was interesting to be reminded of the clear delineation between Unitarian and Universalism. Yeah, I mean, our histories really only came together in the 20th century. I mean, we were, the Unitarians and the Universalists were connected long before they merged in 1961, but they did have, separate paths, separate and distinct paths.
So I was raised Unitarian Universalist, so some of the stories, it was nice to revisit them and examine them a little bit more deeply. But I especially liked reading about Judith Sargent Murray. I hadn't known her story that well, and I was really impressed with just her strength and all of the things that she did in a time when women were so oppressed.
Yeah. And that's the funny part about, I think, Unitarianism and the idea of Jesus' divinity. If you are a true believer and a follower of Jesus and the specific things in there, he had an entourage of women that were a part of his movement. They weren't just Mary and Martha, the cooks and the hostesses and everything, but from my reading, I like to read the Jefferson Bible and the American Standard Bible because they cut out a lot of the fluff and the these and the thous, but they also pull the divinity and the Trinity right out of there. The disciple who Jesus loved was the disciple who Jesus loved, and John. In some interpretations, they hold John as the disciple who Jesus loved, when in fact it was Mary Magdalene. So the idea that the first persons who saw him, even coming out of the grave in the Trinity story of him being divine, were the women. But in leadership and throughout the history of the church, early foundations, absolutely forgotten or relegated to the sidelines as the help. Heather put down, she hoped not only the interesting stuff that Sarah pointed out, but that they considered religion as just another way of exploring the universe, not just, it helped look at the world with a brand new set of lenses.
It is interesting, how many, even going back to Michael Servetus, who was a doctor, how many folks who, in terms of their intellectual life, were really grounded in science and rationalism. It is interesting how that is a part of many of the folks that we lift up as, sort of important characters in our story did come out of a more rational way of looking at the world. Yeah. Jess is doing the Edict 450 this Sunday.
Woot!
Okay. Yeah, Edict of Torta. We're having everybody, or not everybody, but some congregations are having, big parties to celebrate the 450th anniversary. So, a good time to learn a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we want to move into our going deeper section now and the breakout rooms? There are a couple of questions that I think we need to show on the slide.
Let me minimize this and pull that slide up again. There it is.
So there's 2 or 3 questions that are going to come up on this slide, and we're going to be in two groups of 6. So it may be, that we can't get to 3 different questions. So I think folks just let the conversation flow organically and respond to the questions that intrigue you. And next slide. So we're going to be talking about, so what about kind of focusing in on this first part of our history, from basically from the time of Jesus through the time before Unitarian Universalism comes to America. So what are the stories that still resonate? And I think some of you may have touched on that already. How are we, what are the strengths and challenges of being liberal, a liberal faith, of being acting against the orthodoxy? And what part of the stories are still relevant for us today? How can we simplify and not get bogged down in obscure theological arguments? Oh, who does that? All right. So, you're not going to be able to see these questions. So, if you want to just jot down a note or two about what you might want to chat with your small group. We're going to be in this small group for 15 minutes, and
Yeah.
you will get you'll get a little bit of a warning, and we'll come back together and just take a quick peek at the partner church, and then we'll have our break. So that's what we're doing. I am going to put you're going to get a little thing that says to join a room. So go ahead and click on that to join your room.
And Sarah wanted to remind us that she's chat only. So whoever's in the room with her is going to have to read her comments.
Yeah. All right.
There it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hello.
No. We were just saying we think Sarah can only do chat still.
Okay.
And then the number is Jenny, I think. So if we assign Jenny to the other chat, she's going to be in both.
Okay, I gotcha. So Jenny's phone is the 330, and
I
that
think so.
that needs
I think
to
she
go.
said that.
Okay. So I'm going to move Jenny to breakout room 1. Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah. So how does this heretic thing? How does it still resonate today?
Like I said, I really like it because I feel like it, I don't know, kind of encompasses a lot of who we are. Maybe I'm being a little bit lighthearted about it, but, you know, kind of going against the grain and really challenging the status quo has always been the mark of a heretic. You know, that's someone that didn't want to fall in line. And I personally like that very much. And I also think that that's something that UUs embrace because we like learning and we like exploring and we like personal growth. So I think we're still heretics, at least according to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, particularly in our current political context, where the sort of the Christian tradition is lifted up above others, I think that our heretic cred is given new meaning. Yes.
Yeah.
Sarah has raised her hand. You are in the chat room for the breakout. Can you hear us? Oh, yes. You're in a chat group with Beth and with Heather and myself, Pat, Megan, and Jess. And I can read your chat. So if you have thoughts, I don't know if others can see your chat. I think just
No, I can't.
because I'm
No, we can't see your chat.
All right.
Because it's in the main room, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's popping up on my screen because I'm a host. So as we're chatting, Sarah, feel free to to write in the chat and to listen. Okay. All right. Others. Any other thoughts about heretics?
I think I've only worked for fellowships, and I find that that's an interesting sort of dynamic because I've only been member of a church, both UU, but the fellowship mentality seems to embrace that heretic background, and they're really proud of it, and they really want to, lift that up every Sunday morning where they say we're a non-creedal religion, and I wonder how much of that hurts us, to embrace that so fully that non-churched or people who come from a church background get a little put off by it because it feels like we're not owning our faith as much, maybe. That there are Christians within our communities. There are pagans and all kinds of other folks in between. And I don't know how much of that is good. This whole, yes, we're off the grid. We're not, mainstream or whatever. I don't know how much of that is good or bad.
Yeah. Do folks know what Jess is talking about when she says fellowship? Is that a term that anybody is not confused by? It was a program of the mostly of the 1950s, where congregations were started in the thick of the humanist days, without ministers, and with just sort of a different sort of sense of authority in the congregation. That's interesting, Jess.
It's actually, it's interesting. It reminds me of when I first did our new member orientation, when I first came to UUFG, one of the questions I asked of the member that was running the orientation, why isn't everyone UU? Like, why is this something that hasn't just caught on? And she gave me a really interesting answer. It's because some people really like that order. Some people like the idea of the hierarchy or those very orderly, strict kind. Strict's a harsh word, but so I feel like structure, yeah. But you're right. I mean, it's out of a lot of people's comfort zone, and so we have to be mindful of that just as much as we have to be mindful of other people's cultures. So, it's a good point.
Great. Sarah says, I have found that as heretics, we can define what we don't believe in, while it is easily, she's still typing, or it's still coming to me. Let's see if it is harder to say what we do believe in, and here in Santa Barbara, we are a society. So they are a society. So yeah, I mean, we have that whole thing with, are we a church? Are we a fellowship? Are we a society? Are we a congregation? And we even sort of push back against the traditional way that the community is known. Are there stories that you think would be like useful? Stories from this part of our history that are useful in your RE program today, for example?
As a spirit play teacher, I of course am looking at these stories in the through the lens of baskets, and how can I make story baskets out of these? And I'm sure, I mean, we do have some that are, we have like the Francis David basket and some of the other Unitarian stories, but thinking about which other ones might exist out there, and how to expand our collection of UU history ones is really interesting. I definitely like a Judith Sargent Murray basket sometime in the future. Have to get on my basket makers about that.
That is great. Yeah, and our youth group would say, "Oh, we need a Michael Servetus basket with a pack of matches in it, right?" Yeah. Oh my goodness. Anybody else?
I would say in general it's useful to have it as background knowledge. I feel like with a lot of the online curriculums, in fact, even especially the early childhood ones, there is kind of a lot of UU history, and that way, you're not learning it as you go along with the kids as someone who's not from Unitarian background. So.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's important to have these stories in the RE programs, because if you're coming from a Christian Sunday school background as a parent, in your mind, that's what your expectation is, that there's a story and there's a learning from the story. So however you present that through spirit play or tapestry of faith or whatever, I think for me personally, I like having a story and a learning that goes with the story. It's just where I live. That's my comfort. So I think it's nice to have, because you can't just always talk about Jesus and those biblical stories. There are other stories that come too that are important.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
But I think that so many of these stories are people who stood up for their beliefs even when they weren't popular. And I think that's always appealing to children and adults to hear those sorts of stories about standing up for what you believe in.
Yeah, for sure. I think some of the early stories where, you know, it's funny because, you know, some people have this impression of Unitarian Universalism as a casual faith, right? Oh, you can believe whatever you want. And yet, when we look back in our far history, we see there were people who literally gave their lives for this tradition that, you know, has come through history to be our version, our modern version of Unitarian and Universalism. So it's nothing casual about our history. And I think we have another contribution here from, Sarah says, standing up even though it is unpopular is a very important lesson for kids.
You know, as we're talking about this, it feels to me like of recent history, we do Rosa Parks stories, we talk about MLK, we talk about all those kinds of things, and non-bullying, non-violence, anti-oppression, all those types of stories are evident 400 years ago. And I'm wondering how many of them we can give new breath and new life to and bring into our current day storytelling for our young people.
Mm-hmm. When I'm looking at this particular piece of our history, I always wonder, you know, how much is it in our DNA to be countercultural? So part of the evolution of Unitarian Universalism is that as the culture moves towards our values and our beliefs, we swing back and we go to another place. It's like we don't ever want to be part of the center. That we have this thing in our DNA that we're always going to be a little bit heretical. So it's interesting. You know, when we talk about, you know, what is our theology and feeling like we can't, it's like a squirrel running around the yard. We can't quite capture it because it's constantly, as soon as it starts to become mainstream, we shift, which is an interesting possibility. So, let's see, I have 3:04, so it looks like we've got about another minute. So let me just, I'm going to close this room, which I think will give us about 30 seconds. So Sarah says we are very counterculture. Here in California, our beliefs are mainstream. Yeah, I think that's true. So here's 30 seconds for, 60 seconds for any last thoughts. And if folks are feeling quiet, we can just, you know, you should get a button that says you can return to the main room, and we'll regather there.
I'm going to be counterculture and leave the room early.
That's fine. Perfect. All right. So Megan, did you say you were getting ready to go to Transylvania? Is that like a summer trip or?
Yeah, so we West Shore has a partner church in Bagyon, Transylvania,
Okay.
or Romania, and we've been going for close to 20 years, and I've never been yet. And I decided this year was going to be the year, so we're going in July. We're doing, because of the Edict of Torda, a tour around and looking at different historical sites, and then I'll be spending a week in the village.
Super. That's wonderful.
Excited.
Yay. Okay, I think most of us are back.
Yep, we're back.
Is your whole group back?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. All right. So I hope that we had good conversation and had an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into this heretical past of ours. And we're going to just take a couple minutes to click on a link for the partner church. Jermaine, do you want me to do that, or do you want to do that?
The link wasn't working out of the thing yesterday, so I can actually just cut and paste it. So I can do that real fast.
Sure. Okay. So many of our congregations have relationships, connections over time. Megan was just saying her congregation, West Shore, has had a relationship for 20 years. I'm with a congregation in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and they've got more than 20 years relationship with a Transylvanian congregation in Zekardesh. And they have been here, and we have been there, and we have even helped to sponsor one of their seminarians who came to Star King. So if you aren't familiar with the partner church, or if your congregation, hey, there you go. Yeah. And there are partner churches in the Philippines. There are partner churches in India. So it's not just in the Transylvanian area of Romania, but there are other parts of the world. Unitarian Universalism is a global faith. So, and there are. I hope you all can see the map. So there are some in the Czech Republic, and a number on the continent of Africa. Hong Kong, I didn't know about Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think that was a plant from Americans that were working overseas.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
So yeah, there's a partnership. So yeah, the pathways to being a partner.
Mm-hmm.
All right, how to be one. And so yeah, you guys can explore this at your own leisure if you haven't already gotten it. But obviously, they've got ties into it. How you can turn the lives of the founding of these churches into the stories for RE classes and being a part in a partnership with it. So there.
Yeah. And I know that in my congregation, of course, not everybody is able to take the time or expend the cost to go to Transylvania to visit. So we have, there are a number of folks who are pen pals. So we encourage folks to just communicate in writing. And of course, things like Zoom and the internet have changed a lot of how we're able to communicate with people, in a totally different culture, and people that we may never meet and never be in the same room with.
Yeah, and it's a great resource for youth because we end up taking 2 to 5 youth every time we make that trip. And every time our partner church makes the trip here, they bring about that same number. So our youth group has a monthly Skype call with the youth group in Transylvania in our partner church, Barote.
Yeah. Yeah, and for many Unitarian Universalist congregations, sometimes there's a little bit of a sense of isolation, like particularly if you are in a rural area, but even if you're in an area where there are other congregations, we're not always so good about really reaching out and connecting with other congregations. And part of that is our congregational polity, that there is this organizational, institutional separation between congregations. But we have, what we call sometimes, like, people think of themselves as UU, but in fact they're Cherry Hillitarians. They really don't have a broader perspective. And so, to open up the eyes of children and youth, the idea that, UUs are not just here, our little enclave, our little group, but really are all across the world. It can be a really exciting and eye-opening conversation. So I recommend you explore that. So it is time for our break. We are going to take a 5-minute break. So, that's not long. It's enough time for a bio break, get up and stretch. We will be back at 3:16, according to my watch. As we begin to return, I am going to share my screen, and hopefully we can get the, let's see, to get the timeline up. Hopefully we don't have any more technical challenges here. Sharing the screen. All right. See if this works. What are we seeing? Does anybody see the timeline? Yeah, okay, great. All right. Couple folks are, I'm not sure if everybody's back, but we're gonna keep moving on just so that we can be sure. Beth, did you have a question?
Nope, just testing out a feature. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. No, I'm glad. It's good to see people use it. We didn't really talk about that at the beginning. So the second half of this first session, we focus on what we call the founders, which is the characters who really brought Unitarian Universalism not only literally into America, but some of the first ministers and some of the first folks to preach the theology of Unitarian and Universalism, but also who brought it into the larger landscape, into the religious conversation of the day. So we're going to start with Thomas Potter, and some of you may know the story of Thomas Potter. It's one of those really famous ones that gets put into a lot of children's religious education curricula. But he built this chapel, and he had a belief in the salvation of all, and he built a chapel and said he wasn't going to go back to his other congregation until the preacher arrived who would preach the gospel as he believed it. And so this ship showed up on got caught in a bad tide just off his property in Good Luck, New Jersey, around Barnegat, New Jersey. The ship was the Good Luck, and off steps John Murray, and he was convinced to stay. He had just left England, and his family had died, and he had been indebted, and he said, I'm not going there. I'm not a preacher anymore. And Thomas Potter said, well, if the tide doesn't turn by Sunday, will you preach? And he did. And John Murray, of course, went on to be recognized as the founder of Universalism in America. George de Benneville was also in America. He was not known as the founder because he was preaching it, but he didn't get the recognition and the notoriety, and he wasn't in the right place at the right time to be named the founder of Universalism. But he was called the first preacher of Universalism in America. And there is a lovely and amazing retreat camp in California that is named for him. Joseph Priestley appears again. Joseph Priestley was a scientist, and he was in England, and he began to preach this idea of universal salvation, that all are saved. And there were folks who just did not agree with that, and so they became an angry mob, and they burned down his home. And like John Murray, who left in some very despairing circumstances, Joseph Priestley came to America, and he was part of the story of Unitarianism as well, and he was part of the founding of the first Unitarian congregation, Church of Philadelphia, which still is around today on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. And you know, he knew Ben Franklin, he knew Benjamin Rush, he knew a lot of the thinkers of the day, many of whom were part of the creating the democracy, creating our country. So he had a connection and relationship with those people, and he may have had somewhat of a voice. And I live in what used to be called the Joseph Priestley District, as do a couple others on this call. It was an area that formerly known as a district. John Murray was identified as our founder, the founder of Universalism. And we've heard the story. It's been called at times a miracle story. One of the interesting things about John Murray is, so there's a wonderful retreat center on the land that at one time was part of Thomas Potter's farm. And there is a church there that is where the church was that John Murray preached in, but is not the church. And there's a plaque that says that has some words that are attributed to John Murray. Give them hope, not hell, which is this very sort of famous line that's attributed to John Murray. And there's been some recent scholarship by the Reverend Susan Ritchie, who is not only a minister, but also an academic and a historian. And it is, Susan contends that he did not actually say that those were not his actual words. So this is the great plaque with these famous words that may not have been said by John Murray. Judith Sargent Murray. So she was married to John Murray. She was his second wife, and he was her second husband. She was a congregant in the church that John Murray preached at up in Massachusetts. She was not formally educated, but she was a prolific writer, an early feminist, and one of the most, she's had a number of important contributions, but one of the most important contributions was the creation of the first catechism for children. And, you know, kind of the catechism of the day was that you would ask a question and children would provide a rote answer. And she flipped that and created a catechism where the adults posed the question and the children were invited to offer answers. And of course, there was some structure to it, but it kind of flipped that and gave children some agency in their own, you know, learning, their own faith development. And that was really the first evidence we have of that kind of thinking. Another really fun thing to know about Judith Sargent Murray, she long outlived John Murray, and she some of her most important work was actually sort of creating the persona of John Murray and really preserving his work and helping to really give him a place in the history of Universalism by making sure that his works were published and that they stayed available and they stayed in the public, in the religious landscape. So she had a lot to do with John Murray becoming this star of Universalism, which is kind of an unusual role for a woman of the 18th or 19th century. The other thing, she was a prolific writer, both letters and essays, and much of her work was lost until she moved from Massachusetts down to Georgia, Natchez, Georgia, where she lived until her death with one of her daughters. And in 1984, there was a home near by where all of her writings, a huge cache of her writings were discovered. 1984. So for over 150 years, a lot of the writings, the letters, some of the essays of Judith Sargent Murray were just left in somebody's attic. So it's an amazing story, and we're glad that her words have come back into our knowing and understanding. Hannah Adams is another I see a lot of stuff in the chat. Jermaine, I'm not following the chat so much. If there's
They were just commenting on the idea of the miracle story. What exactly was the miracle? And
I'm sorry. Somebody, yeah, feel free to unmute and ask me if I gloss over something like that. My apologies.
Nope. I threw it back in there. The miracle was the idea that the weather held the ship, the Good Luck, on that sandbar until after John Murray preached that sermon, and then when he got back on the boat, the wind shifted and they were able to leave.
Yep.
So that was the miracle.
Yeah. Probably a little. It's a little puff in there with a miracle story. It may or may not be grounded in the complete truth. Or Thomas Potter may have been down there putting, loading bricks, anchoring the ship so that it didn't go. So Hannah Adams is another interesting character. She was, again, not an educated woman, but she wrote a couple of really important books, important in her time, where they talked about books that were like the history of religion, and talked about lots of different religions and lots of different understandings of religion in her day. And there really wasn't anything quite like that. And so she really was sort of an unassuming woman. And, the other interesting thing about these women, Judith Sargent Murray, Hannah Adams, they were all cleaning and scrubbing and baking bread and raising families and, living a very, domestic type of 18th century life while they were doing this amazing scholarship and bringing these amazing ideas into the public square. So it wasn't easy for them, but we are grateful that they have survived.
And I think you also actually read within the idea behind it that this book was so well written that it was used as a text at Harvard Theological School, Divinity School, and that at one point someone tried to take credit for her work, but because she had connections like John Adams and 2 presidents, that was was eventually squashed, and she was given the credit she was due.
Yeah. So in 1770, Murray met Potter. We've kind of talked about that, and Murray did preach in this chapel, and eventually made his way to Massachusetts, where basically a congregation was created for him. Hosea Ballou was one of the early Universalist ministers. He was an itinerant preacher, as most Universalist ministers were. And, he was, one of the interesting things about Universalists versus Unitarian is he wasn't a Harvard-educated preacher. He sort of found his religion, which turned out to be Universalism, at the age of 19, and never went to a formal seminary, yet became, one of the most, certainly one of the most revered today, one of the most revered voices of the early understanding of Universalism.
Does everyone understand or know the difference between Universalism and Unitarianism?
Well, that was part of the reading, so hopefully some folks were able to glean that from the reading.
Okay.
Right? Universalism, all are saved. There's no original sin. Unitarianism is sort of the God is one, non-Trinitarian thinking. That's the pinky thumbnail. So this independent Christian church is the church that was created expressly to give John Murray a pulpit. He had actually applied for a position at another congregation, but was not, was still a little bit too outside of the mainstream for that congregation to hire him. So a group created a church for him. Did the Unitarians still believe in saving of only the elect? So that's an interesting question. So theologically, no, but Unitarians were often, more educated, they were more affluent, they were people who had some privilege to them, but they were not Calvinists in the way that we understand that those who are elect. So now we're coming, does that sort of help, Jenny? We're actually I think we'll talk a little bit about that. Trying to think if that comes up again. So we're moving now towards William Ellery Channing. William Ellery Channing really is, as it says here, the single most important figure in the history of American Unitarianism, which is interesting because, he lived in 1780 through 1842. So does his understanding of Unitarianism still resonate, or are we stuck in some hero worship or some older understanding of Unitarianism? Those are sort of rhetorical questions. So he gave a couple of really important sermons, and I think we're going to hear about them soon. Judith Sargent Murray, again, wrote the Universalist Catechism for children in the question and answer format rather than in a rote, there's, particular answers. So the Gloucester Universalist decision was a really important decision. It made way for this understanding of the separation of church and state. In those days, everybody practiced, everybody was part of the standing order. So everybody was practicing, very similar. And so the taxes, the monies that were collected by the church actually went right to the state. And so at some point, this group said, hey, wait a minute, we're different. We have different understandings, and we want to hire our own preacher. And in order to do that, we need to have some agency over our own funds. And so that is sort of when they said, okay, we're going to separate the monies that we collect for the running of the town and the state from the monies that are used for the parish or for the local congregation. And that, of course, became part of our nation's understanding of democracy, although we know that is under threat even today. The first Universalist convention happened in Oxford, Massachusetts. So it's interesting, the Unitarians early in their history were really not interested in being institutionalists. They were really focused sort of on, the individual, ministers, a little bit of hero worship around some of the ministers of that day, mostly Channing. But the Universalists, they were like, wow, we want to gather. And that there are still pieces of that are very much a part of certain areas of the country. For example, we still have a Universalist convention in New York State. We have Universalist convention, very small, in Pennsylvania. And there are some people who have, against Susan Ritchie, the Reverend Susan Ritchie, who has likened there is something called a Summer Institute that happens in Ohio that was part of the tradition of the Ohio Meadville district. And some people have said that is like the gatherings that we used to call conventions. So there's still that yearning and that interest and that desire to be together that exists in some legacy fashion in some parts of the country. Yes, that Jenny's point, nothing had changed for those who came here from England. They only wanted the state. And that was one of the arguments against the Puritans, because most of the standing order and the congregations before the Unitarians really declared themselves had come from the Puritans. So there was a touch of irony there, yes. We do have some founders and writers who were connected to the Constitution. Benjamin Rush was a Unitarian. I'd have to look that one up, but that's a great question. Again, the conventions move a little faster. Joseph Priestley is coming up again. Yeah, he came and helped start the first Unitarian church in Pennsylvania. Aidan Blue started this, the Restorationists and the Hopedale community, which there's a small story about that. That's not as big of a story as some of these others. So we're going to pass by Aidan Blue for now. A lot of these folks, there is an online UU history site that was started years ago by folks who just were interested. And if you Google that, you can actually get quite a bit of history. And I think there's some links to it later on when we get into the 20th century. So this was a really important moment. This was Henry Ware, and he was liberal minister, liberal versus Orthodox. And he became the elected theologian, sort of a standing professor at Harvard. And that was when the Orthodox folks who were more Orthodox realized that they were losing their hold on what the people wanted, what the people believed, and where they were attending church, and whose values and whose theology they were following. So this was a crucial event. Hosea Blue published a treatise on atonement, and there was something in the reading about that his position was that sin is punished on earth during your lifetime, and that all will be saved in the afterlife. That wasn't the only Universalist take. There were some others as well. William Ellery Channing, who was a very diminutive and quiet, sort of, introspective kind of preacher, was invited to come to Jared Sparks' ordination at the new congregation in Baltimore, Maryland. And because of this controversy that had started with Henry Ware getting the professor's chair at Harvard, this was the moment when the first time that William Ellery Channing stood up for this group of liberal ministers and said, yes, we are Unitarian, and these are the things that make us so. And he iterated 4 or 5 points, and it became all the rage, all the rage. And they still celebrate in Baltimore. They still celebrate the first Sunday of May of every year. They celebrate that sermon, the Baltimore sermon, and have special speakers and special guests, and it's a wonderful event. And so during this time, of course, many of the Standing Order congregations were now moving away from that Orthodox way of thinking and becoming more liberal in their theology. Unitarians eventually, reluctantly, did form the American Unitarian Association. They weren't really interested much in institutionalizing, but they realized at some point that they needed to do that. So that takes care of this particular area, this particular little chunk of time. And I'm going to stop my screen sharing. I'm going to try anyway. And we'll see what we can do here. Where's that? There we go. I'm working on 2 screens, so sometimes it gets a little confusing. Yeah. Are you all still seeing my?
We are.
My desktop. All right.
There we go. You're back. You're back. Yes, and Sarah, to answer your question, Federal Street Church is in fact now called the Arlington Street Church. It had one name in between. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it was renamed 3 different times.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so we spent a lot of time on the timeline, but it's trying to give you a sense of how some of these things evolved, and of course there were things going on at the same time. The Universalists, the Universalists and the Unitarians, many of whom were in Massachusetts, many of them did not talk to each other. They had nothing to do with each other. They were sort of involved in their own group, and it's just interesting that here we are today. Right. So we're going to now take another few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, to do a quick breakout. Is that what we're going to do?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And then we're just about done for the day. So I am going to go back here and go back to the breakouts. And we're going to actually go back into that same breakout. Oh, the questions. Do you have the questions?
I do.
I have the questions, yeah. So
they're right there.
Yeah, before we go into the breakout room, so what we wanted to have you focus on just for a few minutes, which we've already talked about, is the role of women in helping to shape our faith in North America. And do you see, what similarities do you see in the roles played by Judith Sargent Murray and Hannah Adams? What differences? And how do we highlight the roles played by women in the way we talk about our history? And are the different origins of the 2 traditions significant today? And we'll just take about 10 minutes. So I'm gonna break you out. Hello again. Carolyn, were you in breakout room, the other breakout room?
Yes, I was. Can you move me over there?
I indeed I can. Sorry about that. For some reason you popped up as being unassigned, which
I'm
moving you. There you go. All right, we're back. Hi, Sarah. So what do you think about these amazing, fabulous women? Sarah says, lost to history. Yeah, it is true. Some of them.
I was just thinking I'm embarrassed to say I don't know that I've heard of them before today and the readings. Like, I'm feeling a little embarrassed by that. Like, all we ever talk about is Sophia Lyon Faz, and then I wonder, well, there must be other women, but we don't often hear of them.
Yeah. Yeah, Judith Sargent Murray gets mentioned sort of tangentially to John Murray, of course, even though she was really the stronger of the two in some people's estimation. And she's come back into the conversation with this unearthing of her lost work. That has really helped to bring her back into our history. Hannah Adams remains lost. So her work was lost down in Natchez, Georgia, in the attic of a home near the home where she lived with her daughter and later passed away. Unknown how it got there, but it was discovered in the 1980s. So it was lost for over 150 years, and there were just lots and lots, hundreds of letters. And other works. It is in the hands of a scholar. It's in the hands of a university. I can't remember off the top of my head. It might be the University of Georgia. I'm not 100% sure. It was found by somebody who was a scholar of hers, of her work. So I'll find that out. But it's like the Indiana Jones of feminist writing, right? Found all of her work. And no boulders, just attic stairs.
I feel like so many of the women from that era were, inspired and excited by that new freedom, especially, early colonial America, but were so overshadowed by the men who were the movers and shakers of that time as well. And so, they were married to powerful men, and so maybe they got a little bit more of a voice, but still, it just wasn't. It's interesting to me that we're still having to deal with how much that overshadowed them, how they got lost to history in the first place, and that we're not doing more to dig them out and say, these women had something to say, and there's a lot of times they said it and it still got lost. So it's powerful to me that's at least in a little bit coming back around. So people want to know their story.
Yeah. Sarah asked if she was related to the painter. I assume you mean John Singer Sargent. Yes, I believe she was related to the painter. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, so much of it was just, situational circumstances. Like, for instance, Hannah Adams, so her brothers were educated, she was not. But at some point, she was taught to read, which many women were not even taught to read in that time. She was taught to read, and her father owned a store at some point in her life that sold books. And so she was self-educated. So had her father been a seaman or, something else, a businessman, instead of having a store that sold books, would we have this story and this history? And how many other women were there that didn't have an opportunity but had these brilliant understandings?
Well, and that too, if she was self-educated too, that someone didn't tell her to stop or force her to stop, because I feel like that probably happened more times than we will ever know. Mm-hmm. Is that they were actively silenced in their formative years to know, you can't read that. What are you doing? So it's
Yeah,
sad.
I don't know about Hannah Adams, but I do know that Judith Sargent Murray, her early works were published under another name because they said if you publish it under your name, first of all, it won't get published, and second of all, it won't be taken seriously.
Yeah.
So that was part of it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is sad. Anybody else, or any of these stories that kind of jumped out for you in this little section? A lot of people know Thomas Potter and John Murray. Hosea Ballou maybe was a new name for some of you. Channing. Channing was also the author of one of the most used readings for things like R.E. Sunday. He wrote The Great End in Religious Instruction. That is Channing's work. So he was a prolific writer, and so much of his work continues to resonate and make sense. If you really, it's hard to get through some of that 19th century, expression of language, but if you read his work, the Sunday School Address, it is all so, it makes so much sense, and so much of it is still true. It's really fascinating. Sarah says, I'd like to understand better the annual celebration that is done to commemorate the Baltimore sermon. Yeah, they celebrate this milestone, and usually somebody somewhat prominent in the denomination is invited to preach. And I don't know that it is that they're expected to offer words that will have as much, that will last as long as Channing's in our memory, but typically it's a big deal to be invited to preach there. So. And the Baltimore congregation is a beautiful old downtown, lovely congregation. As is the congregation, which Joseph Priestley's congregation, the First Unitarian Congregation in Philadelphia, which is a beautiful, there's a very famous architect who's designed that building. It's not the same building, but it's the same congregation. But that building, they have Tiffany windows, and they have some original artifacts from some of the early churches. So I know that many of our coming of age youth go to Boston for the heritage trip, but there's so much history in other places. Philadelphia, there's a lot of Unitarian history. St. Louis, there's a ton of history. So we've had some folks in the past who have done their final presentation, have done like a kind of a coming of age trip for another area. Somebody did Washington, D.C., somebody did Philadelphia. So it's fun to think of how can we connect with our history in places that are geographically not only closer, but maybe more familiar to us and to our families. So the Tiffany windows, there are Tiffany windows in Philadelphia at the congregation in downtown Philadelphia. So they are lovely. We are just about out of time, so I am going to close this room, and we're almost done for the day. Our friends will be coming back very soon. There we go.
Jenny, you got cut off in the middle of what you were saying when we got moved back to the chat room, well, to the main room.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. No, we're having some sound
Jenny's
issues.
Yeah, we had some sound issues. Or Jenny was
Yeah.
having some. Yeah.
Oh. Jenny just hopped back on and just wanted to let you know that we missed the tail end of what you were saying.
That's great. Oh, that's great.
Oh, it's okay. I don't know where it ended, but that's all right.
You were talking about how your church was more on the Universalist side.
Yeah, the church that I was a member of for many, many years, and we're founders of the university in town. However, the leaders of the church were the presidents of the church and the university at the time, and their names are all over the city, which is fascinating to me because we're kind of out in the suburbs and we're not not really very well known, but the leaders in our church are everywhere on the street names and building names and things like that. And Sojourner Truth gave her speech on the steps of that church as well, her A9 woman speech. So a lot of tradition that we're proud of.
That's amazing.
That is cool.
We are going to have a little bit of an activity, several sessions from now, where we invite you to share a little history of your congregation. So it'll be great to hear a little bit more about that story then, Jenny. That's fabulous. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to just point out to you one of the suggested readings, I believe, was to look at some of the readings in our hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition. So, you know, we've had that hymnal since 1994, and we pick it up and use it regularly. And first time I ever took this UU history course, and all of a sudden I realized how much history I was holding in my hand. I was amazed. So, you know, you can really follow our story a little bit by the choices of the readings. There's a reading by Hosea Ballou. There's a reading by Channing. There's a reading by, I don't remember, there's John Murray. So, yeah, so, I mean, so some of these same actors that were, you know, really important, integral to our early history, show up in that hymnal in familiar readings that we use on a semi-regular basis. So it's a great resource. It's a great resource for you.
And another thing you can do, if you look in the back, they've got all those pages with the numbers and the names and stuff like that. You can actually go and find the hymns that are inspired by some of the writings of these people as well. So you won't only get their words, but songs that were directly the inspired by those particular readings.
Yep. Yeah. Which is really cool. I mean, when you begin to connect those threads, it's really it's kind of fun. So I think that's all we have time to say about Singing the Living Tradition, Jermaine, unless you have any other final thoughts on it.
No, I think it's pretty good.
We're gonna
just thinking of new ways of using that would be the idea. Like as a part of this course, you guys are going to be writing that 250-word reflection, and that could be something that would be one of those work projects. How is the hymnal a historical document for our faith?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Jess is going to be doing our closing for us. Just a reminder to do some thinking, to do some reflecting. We don't expect it to be polished. It can be stream of consciousness. Just, think about, what resonated for you, what were you excited about? Was there anything that you were sad or disappointed about in some of the stories that you've heard? And how might you use it in a practical way, if you can think of a way or two. We do have a quick closing reading before, I think, for all of us.
Oh, on the screen, so lovely.
Yeah, there it is.
I printed it out and everything.
Uh,
Outwitted by Edwin Markham. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in.
great.
Yeah. So thank you guys for coming
Yep. Yes.
and
Thank you for
participating
being
so
here.
well in the class.
Yeah, we'll be seeing you on the page, and we'll also be sending you some emails. So be on the lookout for emails. We'll send you the sign up, the link to the sign up to do the opening or the closing. Yep. All right.
right.
Have a great week.
Have a great week and good Sundays for all of you who are on Sunday.